A trapper named Jedediah is crouching in 2 feet of water 300 miles from the closest settlement, of snow. His breath frozen in his mouth before it can escape. The wind cutbacks in November 40 mph through the Rocky Mountains, with the temperature dropping to 15 less than zero. He tries to light damp kindling with trembling hands. Behind him is nothing. No cover, no defense, just a grizzly-infested open wilderness surpassed people by 1,000 to 1. Where mistakes don't hurt and winter storms endure for 3 weeks in a row, they kill you. This isn't a story for a campfire. November 1825 is the date, and across hundreds of trappers in the northern Rockies must make the same calculation. Winter has come early. Beaver streams are solidly frozen. And each and every man. One question that divides survival from death must be addressed when working these mountains. Where are you going to be when the actual does the cold arrive? Those that make a mistake just disappear. In the spring, search teams discover their corpses strewn around by animals, or never come across them at all, or frozen solid in creek bottoms. However, those who have some knowledge of log construction, which involves assessing timber, selecting a site, and using only an axe and willpower to produce shelters that aren't limited to winter survival. They are experts at it. The hut of the mountainman wasn't a romanticized idea of country existence. It was a well-thought-out engineering fix for a setting intended to murder you. Furthermore, the men who constructed them were not studying manuals or following designs. They submitted an application, information that has been refined by harsh experience, altered by dire necessity, and passed down through the sort of trial and error in which, if you failed, your bones would be added to the ranks of the high country's casualties. Permit me to demonstrate for you how they achieved it. Because of what these men knew about constructing under harsh circumstances, about collaborating with restricted resources, about building a shelter that would be resistant to pressures that would crush traditional building, that some of the most useful wilderness engineering ever created on the American frontier is represented by this expertise. The first thing you should know about mountain man cottages is that no one built them out of desire. You constructed since October was coming to an end. You set your trap lines. The closest trading post was 200 miles away from you, and moving any place during the next 4 months would be suicide, according to the geography itself. As soon as Andrew in November 1822, Henry's trapping brigade arrived at the confluence of the Bighorn River. They had precisely 17 days until they were locked in by the first significant snowfall. In position. The men were not aspiring homesteaders hoping to establish a permanent homestead. They were competent trappers who realized that having winter quarters was essential to getting pelts in the spring and turning into a warning story. First, the location was calculated, and it separated seasoned mountain guys from the arrogant. You required 5 items at once, and locating all 5 in the type of environmental reading needed in one location took years to create. Timber comes first. Not just any trees, but 12 to 16-inch diameter conifers with straight trunks. Because lodgepole pine trees grew naturally straight with little taper, they were perfect. Engelmann spruce was effective if there are stands that don't have a lot of branch rot. Although Douglas fir offered superior structural strength, needed more work. The second was water that refused to solidify. Throughout the winter, spring-fed streams continued to flow beneath the ice. Creek crossings frequently remained partially open, even at extremely cold temperatures. The skilled trappers were able to determine where the snow melted. Subsurface water movement was predicted by patterns to continue into December, January, and February. Thirdly, exposure to the south. Views and aesthetic taste were not on the trappers' minds. They were making calculations. Thermal benefit. Every minute of winter sunlight was collected by a cabin that faced south. December at 45 degrees. You might potentially receive 7 hours of daylight at north latitude. Your cabin collected solar heat since it was exposed to the south, starting at 10 a.m. up to 300 p.m. Interior temperatures could rise during that 5-hour period. 15 to 20 degrees with no firewood burning. The difference in temperature was uncomfortable. It was the difference between making it through the winter and depleting your fuel supply by February after 2 months of it's still freezing outside. Fourth, protection from wind without the risk of flooding. Cold air was gathered by valley bottoms, which faced flooding in the spring. Winter storms wreaked havoc on exposed ridges. The location was nestled against a natural windbreak between 30 and 50 feet above valley levels. A thick timber stand or rock outcrop on the northwest side. The role required to remove snow runoff in the spring without allowing melted water to enter your home. Fifth, the proximity of the game. In the Rockies, hunting in the winter was not a pastime. Protein acquisition was required in situations when a snowshoes and 6 hours of work might be needed for a 3-mile round trip. Deer site selection took into account rabbit warrants, bear dens you could avoid, and elk wintering regions. The website experienced trappers needed 2 to 4 days to complete the selection process. They would search across an area of 5 to 8 square miles for these factors to converge. Eager to begin construction, the greenhorns attempted to hurry it. The veterans made an investment. Time up front, since relocating a partially constructed cottage after finding that your site's water supply is frozen solid. No way to turn into a wind tunnel. The building calculation switched to timber after the location was verified. The average mountainman winter shelter was 12 to 16 feet in length. Side. The calculations were accurate. 40 to 50 logs were required for the walls based on the height of the completed wall and log diameter. The roof will have 8 to 12 ridgepoles, 20 to 30 minutes less parts for gable ends and roof rafters. That amounts to between 70 to 92 separate trees that required processing, limbing, hauling to site, and felling. If you equaled 12 to 20 days of cutting work, as many trappers were working alone. If you were with someone, 8-12 days perhaps. With a brigade of 6 soldiers, maybe 4 or 6 days of concerted effort. The cutting sequence was crucial. The longest, straightest logs were cut first by mountain men, because those turned into the sill logs, the wall's bottom courses. The weight of these foundation timbers was anything that is above them. A sill log with a bow or noticeable taper would cause structural issues that would be made worse by each extra course. Thus, the foundation was built using the best lumber. The falling procedure made use of borrowed adapted from the Scandinavian timber heritage to operate independently in isolated areas. One trapper would make a directional cut on the side where he intended the tree to stand after analyzing each tree's lean and branch loading. Fall. A hinge of uncut material remained after the back cut entered from the other side, just above the base of the notch, timber that determined the direction of the fall. If done properly, a 16-inch diameter pine might be placed precisely where you within 2 feet of the target, as needed. Here's what made it challenging, though. The majority of mountain men only carried one felling axe with a 30-inch handle and perhaps 3 to 4 pounds of head weight. That instrument had to drop branches, score notches, form joins, cut down trees, and serve as a general hammer. Since you would be striking frozen wood and rocks, it couldn't be extremely sharp. It must not be overly boring. Since you needed to process 70 trees, the blade was sharpened to a functional sharpness through nightly edge maintenance, edge that struck a balance between durability and cutting efficiency. The work of limbing separated the struggling from the skilled builders. 20 to 40 branch stubs required to be removed from each tree when it was brought down. Cutting too deeply into the trunk wood lost energy and produced air spaces in the stacked walls, but leaving stubs weaknesses. The effective technique was to smoothly clip branches that were flush with the trunk, leaving the surface that is prepared for stacking without further effort. The next problem was transportation. A 12th log of green pine, weighing between 200 and 250 pounds and measuring 14 inches in diameter. 1. It was too heavy for a man. He was scarcely able to drag it. Using geography and leverage, the mountain men devised a method. When feasible, they would fell trees uphill from the construction site, then move logs downhill with the help of gravity. In order to create a skid surface that decreased friction, they would shave one side of the wood flat on level ground. For more extensive movements, they would cut an 8-foot-long log with a lower diameter and make a shallow groove along its length and utilize it as a runner for a sled. The trapper might tug the building log as it rolled onto this runner. Rope-based assembling. It was not quick. Transporting 70 logs 100 yards at an average distance equaled 40 to 60 hours of labor-intensive transporting to the construction site. Though the majority of historical narratives ignore the site preparation that preceded the actual wall construction, the trappers didn't simply begin stacking logs on the exposed ground. They removed organic soil and vegetation, down to the rock or mineral basis. Next, they placed 4 big, flat stones. Each corner of the plan structure has one. The bearing surface produced by these cornerstones kept the sill logs away from direct contact with the earth. You wouldn't believe how important this detail was. Sign in moisture was absorbed through capillary action upon direct contact with soil. In the Rocky Mountain freeze-thaw cycles, the wood fiber expanded and split during the winter when the moisture converted to ice. A log remained dried on stone. Years passed with a dry log. A damp log decayed within months. Next, the sill logs were placed in a square or rectangle, based on the preferences of the builder. The majority of mountain men constructed 12x12 or 14x14-foot square structures. The measurements weren't made at random. They stood for the highest clear span that could be used for roofing. accessible materials while preserving structural soundness when subjected to snow loads. Professional and amateur building were differentiated by the corner joinery. There were various notching styles. Each includes benefits and drawbacks. Taking inspiration from Scandinavian custom, the saddle notch entailed cutting a curved. Each log had a dip on the top that was the same diameter as the log crossing above it that was perpendicular. When cut correctly, the joint shed water away from the intersection and fastened the logs together. The dovetail notch provided additional security by cutting trapezoidal wedge shapes that were unable to separate, bearing stress from the side. However, dovetails needed to be carved more precisely and took more time to complete. In November, a lone trapper working in the snow might decide on more straightforward square notches that depend on weight for stability and could be cut fast. The usual, although building alone was customary, the construction procedure required 2 workers if at all possible. The initial 4 to 6 logs. Because the logs could be hoisted straight into position, courses were comparatively easy to climb. But after the walls reached waist height, there was a significant lifting issue. A log weighing 200 lbs had to ascend from the bottom to a height of 4 feet, then be placed exactly into joints with notches. Leverage solutions were employed by the mountainmen. They would construct a basic slope out of 2 angled logs that lean in opposition to the partially constructed wall. Using poles as levers, the next log rolled up this ramp. At the summit, they would, using pry bars composed of straight branches with forked ends, move it into place. It was a demanding job. It could take 30 minutes of consistent effort to raise a single log into the 8th or 9th course. The design of the sleeping platform was important for survival. Air that is cold sinks. In a mountain cottage, sleeping on the floor meant breathing air that can be 20 degrees cooler than waist-level air. The elevated platform raised you above floor drafts and placed you in the warmer air layer. These were built by numerous builders. Platforms made of poles with smaller diameters arranged side by side to make a surface. It allowed air to circulate underneath while supporting a man's weight. The materials used to make the bedding were whatever the trapper had on hand. Buffalo robes were valued for their superior insulating properties and their ability to several objectives. When the temperature dropped to 0 degrees, a quality buffalo robe kept you warm, without extra blankets. Bear hides operated in a similar manner. You might use dried grass to fill a sleeping bag in an emergency or pine needles, changing the fill weekly when it became compacted and lost its insulating properties worth. It was difficult to store food within the cabin since mountain cabins drew the exact type of guests you did not wish to have. Wolverines, grizzlies, black bears, and other animals that hadn't completely hibernated, predators could smell food that had been preserved for a long time. A cottage made of logs with a determined bear would not be deterred by chinked walls. They could just push logs apart or rip through chinking with sufficient inspiration. As a result, food had to be hung from the rafters in the middle of the hut, away from the walls in wooden containers or leather bags. Because of this, it was protected from smaller predators that could have gotten through gaps and only partially shielded from bears that would have to enter the building completely to get there. Not flawless, but preferable to storing food in a corner or on the floor. Most settlers had to plan for water availability during the winter. Never gave it any thought. Your local brook would freeze. Ice could accumulate in the high Rockies that is 18 to 24 inches thick by mid-January. It took tremendous work to cut through this ice every day in order to get to the water. In order to sustain flow beneath the ice, astute trappers located seeps or springs close to their hut locations. A place where you could cut through 6 inches instead of 20 to save hours of labor during the winter. A tiny spring home, which is basically a tiny wood building, was built by some builders, constructed right on top of a water supply. Enough earth heat was retained in the enclosed area to maintain the spring's partial opening, even at extremely frigid temperatures. Because it took more time to construct, this wasn't typical, although on locations with the it paid off all winter long with the perfect spring traits. Calculating firewood meant the difference between life and death. Math. A 7,000-foot high mountain man dwelling in the Rockies via approximately 6 to 8 cords of wood were needed throughout the winter, which lasted from mid-November until late March. A cord's dimensions are 8 feet long, 4 feet broad, and 8 feet high. Each cord contains 128 cubic feet of stacked wood. Cutting, splitting, and stacking more than 1,000 cubic feet of firewood was required for 8 cords. Every piece had to be brief, enough to accommodate your fireplace, usually 16-20 inches long, and it had to be split to properly dry. Between 40 and 60% of green wood is moist. It gets burned poorly and increases the risk of a fire by causing an excessive buildup of creosote in your chimney. Seasoned wood was allowed to dry for 6 burns clean and hot for months. However, there were no 6 months for mountain development in November. Green wood was cut and burned. Accepting the trade-offs out of need, in order to produce the same amount of heat, greater volume has to be burned. It required regular chimney cleaning in order to remove creosote. It required realizing how much fuel you use would be greater than desired. Thus, you had to make more cuts than the minimums that were predicted. The actual chopping of firewood became the norm for the duration of the winter. All winter wood could not be harvested and stacked ahead of time due to storage. There wasn't much room surrounding a 12-sack-12 hut. The majority of trappers keep 2 or 3 wood was heaped and covered at the door for weeks, and as the weather allowed, more was cut. Wood cutting on days that are clear. Huddling inside and burning through your stash on stormy days. The choice of wood made a big difference. Pine burnt hot and quickly, which is useful for rapid heating, but it needs to be fed constantly. Aspen burned far more quickly and was nearly worthless for fires that occur overnight. At high elevation, oak was non-existent. Usually dead-standing or Douglas fir was the finest choice. Lodge pole pine that was starting to dry out on its own. These were plentiful, produced good heat, and burnt more slowly. More than most historical sources admit, security considerations played a role in cabin design. The Mount Rocky. The fur trade had place in disputed area between 1820 and 1840, where ties with different tribes varied from friendly to downright antagonistic. Despite being a top target for Blackfoot warriors, the trapper may have good connections with Crow allies. As invaders, beaver trappers are exhausting their resources. The protective characteristics were well-considered design features, rather than ornate fortifications. One strong door that is blocked from the inside with it was challenging to force entry due to a hefty wooden beam. Without windows, it would be difficult. Lines of sight into the interior. Orienting the cabin so that the door faces away from the direction of travel direction alerted you in advance of an approaching person. Some trappers narrow the spaces between logs and cut firing ports, able to be opened from the inside at shoulder height. These made it possible to observe and, if required, self-protective defense fire. It had nothing to do with training for close combat. Making your cabin more difficult to target than alternatives was the goal, urging possible raiders to go past. The construction schedule for a fully furnished cabin operating independently was 3 to 6 months. Weeks, based on how many shortcuts the builder took and his level of skill. 3 weeks of 12-hour days was a valiant attempt, allowing for harsher finishes. 6 weeks reflected consistent effort. Appropriately, taking time on specifics like careful chinking and sufficient firewood storage. The majority of trappers want to have within 10 to 14 days, the walls and roof were finished, and a week later, the chinking, fireplace, and door that gave